Sarah, welcome to Zündfunk.
Thank you for having me.
Nice to have you here. Are you the first time in Munich?
This is my first time in Munich, and it's beautiful so far.
And you live in Germany, or have been living in Berlin, is that true?
I have been living in Berlin the last few months. I almost sort of don't have a home. I've been traveling quite a lot, but basically the last 3 years I was in Berlin.
Why did you choose to leave Great Britain? Had this political reasons?
I didn't really choose to leave, actually. I was actually for WikiLeaks in Australia when Edward Snowden came forward as the NSA whistleblower. He reached out to WikiLeaks for help, and I ended up being the one to help get him out of Hong Kong safely and asylum in Russia. I stayed with him in Russia for 4 months and then was looking after the point it was clear he was settled and fine and was able to start a life there with asylum. I was looking for where I could go. Unfortunately, over the period where we had been in Russia, the UK had opened a terrorism investigation into this issue, into the Guardian and anybody that was working on the Snowden documents and had been working with Snowden. And this had meant that actually David Miranda, who had been doing journalistic work for the Guardian, was stopped under the Terrorism Act in the UK. He was forced to give up passwords and answer questions. You have no right to silence under this act in the UK. And my lawyers were sure that the same would happen to me. And I didn't want to be compelled to give passwords or to have to answer questions to do with sources due to my work with WikiLeaks and Edward Snowden. Therefore, I didn't want to go back to the UK. So the question was where to go. And we looked and my lawyers looked, and the answer was that Germany would be a good place, not necessarily because the laws are more or overly protective over certain other nations, but because there was a large political and public movement of support for these issues at that time. Stribler had just been to visit Edward Snowden. The day I landed in Berlin, Der Spiegel had Asylum for Snowden on their front cover. So these were things that were not happening in other countries.
This is 3 years ago.
Yes.
Could you go back to Great Britain today?
Yes, I'm had a very good summer. David Miranda, the person who was stopped under Schedule 7, the Terrorism Act before, took a case to say that it was illegal for journalists to be stopped under this act, that they should be ring-fenced. And although he lost initially, he kept appealing and he stayed strong with this legal case, and he won it just in 2016. And that enabled me to go back to the UK and to have the protections to know that I wouldn't be stopped under this.
I said there is a lot of stuff to talk about concerning WikiLeaks. First of all, this week came the news that President Obama, nearly former President Obama, has commuted Chelsea Manning's sentence. She will be free in May this year. I suppose you classify this as good news?
I definitely classify that as good news. I don't think that Obama should be celebrated for this fact for a couple of reasons. First, in the first place, he still allowed Chelsea Manning to be imprisoned for 35 years at the beginning and has began and perpetuated a war on whistleblowers, having imprisoned more whistleblowers than all other presidents combined. So I think the fact that he's commuted Chelsea Manning's sentence, while this is clearly a good thing to happen and was vitally needed for Chelsea Manning, who has tried to commit suicide a couple of times recently, this does not do away with the harm he has already done. Also, let's not forget he didn't pardon her. She is still to be held by the US judicial system as having committed something wrong, committed a crime.
Do you think there has been a change of mind, or what might be the reason for the decision this week?
I wouldn't like to presume what Obama was thinking in this. I can imagine that it was a lot for humanitarian reasons. As I just mentioned, Chelsea Manning had attempted suicide a couple of times. She is clearly in a very difficult position, being in a military jail as a transgender woman, and she needs more help and support than the system was giving her. I would imagine that these sorts of humanitarian reasons would at least have come into his decision.
Okay, the big question is now, how does this decision affect Julian Assange? He's living in the Ecuadorian embassy for almost 5 years right now. And in at least 2 tweets, he announced that he would agree to an extradition to the US in case Manning should be granted clemency. Although it's not quite clear what crime he has done in the US, what he's going to be accused there.
Well, there is an ongoing, and it has been proven, continues to be proven, and including reasonably recently, that there is an active US grand jury into Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, particularly Julian Assange. He is the main target of this investigation, looking to indict him for crimes such as espionage, conspiracy to commit espionage under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. So there's clearly a will from the United States to get him and to prosecute him. Whether an indictment has been made at the moment is unclear, as you say. Julian has always said that he would be willing to stand a fair trial, but similarly to Edward Snowden's case, the United States does not conduct trials in these cases in a fair manner.
His lawyers said in the last 2 days things were not that clear. Maybe he goes, maybe he goes not. You are called his closest advisor in Wikipedia. What do you advise him, to go or not to go?
How Wikipedia describes me, I wouldn't sort of really like to necessarily state as fact. I work on publications at WikiLeaks. I'm a journalist there. This is clearly a legal question for him. So I think that it's best that we stick to allowing the lawyers to answer that question on what he should or shouldn't do in this case.
Okay, but you are in contact with him, of course, over the last few years. Living in an embassy, even it's a beautiful one.
It's a very small one, actually.
Yeah,
it's the
but
smallest embassy I've ever seen.
It's a small one. You can't go outside.
Yeah.
That's not very far away from prison, although he has internet access, which is
although
worth a lot, I guess.
Most prisoners do get outside time. So yes, he has internet access, he can have some visitors, but he doesn't get sunlight, which is obviously needed for one's health as well. So he is in a hugely difficult situation. The United Nations has ruled that the United Kingdom and Sweden are arbitrarily detaining him. That means that the reason for the detention is false, the reasons which they're using, that they should let him go immediately and actually he should be compensated, and that actually the UN has described the treatment that the United Kingdom and Sweden are enforcing him to be under by enforcing this detainment does amount to degrading and inhumane treatment. He is in an extremely difficult situation and is only remaining in that way because of the clear lack of due process and lack of justice that he is receiving in his cases.
How does he cope personally with that?
It is very difficult for him. He's kept strong and by the work. There is a lot of work to be done. He has always focused on his work, and I think that keeps him going. I think predominantly his personality. I think anybody else would have gone mad by that stage. I think it's really a testament to him and his strength that he's still there and keeping working.
You met Julian Assange in 2010 and started to work with him for WikiLeaks. Can you describe a little how this happened?
Yeah, I was actually working for a good friend of Julian's, Gavin McFadden, at the Centre for Investigative Journalism in London. And Julian was coming to the UK to release the Afghan war logs and asked Gavin if he knew a couple of good journalists that were working with him, that Julian could work with Julian temporarily, volunteer for him just over this period. And myself and a colleague, Joseph Farrell, were the ones that Gavin suggested, and we agreed. And so we went to help Julian for a few days, and well, that's turned into 2 years.
What did you like about WikiLeaks? What was the thing that maybe fascinated you? My original sort of training or education was actually as a scientist. So the concept of source documents and the public being able to have access to the actual data, as it were, to use the sort of scientific term, the data that backed up the journalist's claims was something that I found very intriguing and very important. WikiLeaks was and still is the only media organization that does that in such a full and complete way. This I found very important idea. The ideals that WikiLeaks was conducting its journalism for, to allow the public to understand, to self-determine and bring them knowledge and then let them decide for themselves, I thought was the way journalism sort of really should be done. And of course, the innovative concept, which now, of course, is in many newsrooms, but of a anonymous Dropbox for sources, was something that I thought was
the right way to approach this topic, and the ethics, the very strong and central ethics of complete source protection that WikiLeaks was and remains attached to this day, I found compelling and believed in strongly.
And what is your job right now there? What exactly are you doing?
Well, I've been working on the publications, but I also do some speaking roles for the organization. Writing. I'm a journalist, so I research, write, analyze how to present the data and the information that we publish. But yes, since for the last few years, I've also had a public role, which is why I'm sitting in this chair now.
WikiLeaks has always been criticized, even in 2010. But during the last year, there has been a lot of criticism from people who were friends of WikiLeaks and who liked it the years before. But many people were disappointed by the role that took WikiLeaks in the US election campaign, that you damaged Hillary Clinton's campaign by releasing these internal documents from the Democrats, the emails. For many people, this looked a bit like a payback for Clinton's role in the Chelsea Manning affair. Haven't you damaged yourself a little bit with these releases?
I mean, people have attacked us recently. People have, as you mentioned, though, people have always attacked us. What is interesting to us is that the side seems to switch depending on who we publish about, which makes me wonder, do those that support us at any moment, are they actually believing in the concepts of transparency and the journalism that we do, or do they just like that we're exposing certain types of people? The same people that are giving some attacks at the moment celebrated us when we were exposing about Bush's wars. So on that front, I like to keep my head down and keep with the work. And as long as we're doing the work that we always have done, which is what we have been doing, then to me, that is the main thing. Much has been made, and I think it's really a politicized comment for other goals about where did the documents come from, etc. We validate information, we ensure that it is correct. And other than that, our main principle is to publish true information that we receive as soon as we can. That is what we did in 2016, just as we have done in every other year.
So you deny that WikiLeaks is biased in any form?
Yeah. I mean, we can only publish what we receive. I would have loved it if we'd received loads of things on Trump, but we didn't. So,
but there was this La Repubblica interview from Julian, which you could understand as a yes to the payback question. So there were a few words where we could think, okay, it was a kind of a payback.
I don't know what words you're referring to. I would say whatever Julian. There's 2 points to make over that. One, the La Repubblica interview was taken and picked up by other media, for example, The Guardian, who spun it quite a lot, and actually then other media, Glenn Greenwald, for example, then wrote about The Guardian spinning it wrong. So it started this whole thing. It was quite amazing. So I don't know the quote that you're referring to. Either way, I mean, whatever Julian may or may not have said in an interview, it doesn't mean that the work that we have been doing over 2016 had a bias in it. Do you see what I mean?
And then there is the question about Russia. You mentioned it before. Have all these files been stolen by Russian hackers? Even Donald Trump said he believes it came from Russia. Julian Assange has denied that it came from the government or the intelligence. But can you be sure? Whoever your source is, you won't name it, of course, but can you be sure that there isn't the intelligence or the government behind your source? Do you check things like this, or do you just care about if the data is authentic?
Our predominant concern is if the data is authentic. In the way that our Dropbox is set up is so that we actually don't know who the source is ourselves. It protects. The interesting thing actually on this question is the most recent comment made by Obama just the other day. He referred to it as leaks. He referred to a source being within the DNC. So the claims that have come from the US intelligence community that have never been backed up are already falling apart. So again, and this is something that we've seen a number of times, very large rhetorical arguments and debates are brought up, which essentially seem to bring in just propaganda accusations. And I would ask everybody to constantly question what these sorts of officials say and why they're using the words they're using and the arguments that they are. If nobody has any evidence that it is Russian hackers or the Russian government, nobody has any evidence at all, but they are scaremongering. and asking the media to perpetuate this. It reminds us of other things, the Iraq War in the US, etc., etc. So I think that surely we've got to the stage where people are starting to question and want to see evidence. This is one of the reasons why I believe in the work of WikiLeaks so much, the publishing of the source documents so that people can question from the actual information that proves something. Otherwise, everything is just speculation. And I, particularly when it comes to sourcing, wouldn't like to speculate any further.
There have been a lot of rumors, a lot of reports concerning Russian agents among the WikiLeaks team. I suppose that's all wrong.
Apparently I'm a Russian agent. Yes, it's all rubbish. I don't know how to prove I'm not one, but I definitely, it suits certain people's agenda. I've grown a thick skin through it, and I just I find it funny in some ways now. It's just so preposterous often.
Let's look at the more exciting things of life. You've come to Munich for a conference on surveillance, which is not so exciting, but the conference will be. You are one of the curators of this conference. What is the focus?
Well, what we wanted to achieve with this is, yes, look at the topic of surveillance, but try and look at it through some lenses that it isn't always being looked at the moment. There's a lot of technical conferences on it, legal conferences focusing on those aspects. And of course, we will bring that in. But we wanted to also give a slightly different view as well and really understand surveillance in the whole context. What does it really mean for us and for everybody? We begin, for example, on our opening night with a 13-year-old girl and her concept of privacy and why surveillance matters to her. Why should people really be caring about these issues? What really can we do? If we don't do something, where will it head? How does big data come into it? The corporate side, what about in the global south? So there's slightly I would say a larger aspect than just looking at it from a technical point of view. And also being in a theatre, we very much wanted to bring in some cultural ways to examine this very complex topic.
You are one of the few faces of WikiLeaks. Do you think you are surveyed, wiretapped, whatever yourself?
Yeah, I'm sure they are attempting to at least electronically surveil me. We obviously are trained in ways to operate securely online using encryption. We will be training, I'll be on stage, but we have crypto parties over the weekend at the conference. So if anybody else is interested in learning these things, they can come along and learn how to use some forms of encryption on your computer and on your phone. I think these things I have to learn it for my work. I have to do it to very high levels. But there are some easy tools now that are becoming more and more used that can just, by using something slightly different, mean that you are stopping or at least making the barrier high enough that it becomes less and less likely that the government is surveilling everybody.
And how do you deal with the option that some intelligence from which country ever could be interested in what you're doing? Maybe someone is following you, maybe you're being wiretapped. Does this change your life in any way?
Well, until I was traveling around and doing speaking quite a lot this year, I didn't have a phone for several years. So I suppose people find that a bit weird. I try not to get too paranoid. It would be very easy to get paranoid. And I think that would then, might send me mad, but also would make me very inactive and you would end up doing nothing. And I think that's a balance that people that really work in this industry need to find, that yes, one needs to be aware of the issues and the risks. But if you get too paranoid, you'll just never do anything. And I think that is the worst thing possible, that we all become inactive.
I have to get back to the thing you mentioned in the beginning of this interview, your flight with Edward Snowden from Hong Kong to Moscow and the time you stayed with him there. What can you tell us about this? What was the thing you have still in your mind about this time?
It's funny, everybody sort of assumes that it must have been very, very exciting. I can assure you, sitting in a room in an airport for a month is really, really boring. I think it was more exciting for the rest of the world with the news of presidents' planes being downed and all this sort of stuff going on. And we were sort of sitting there, other than putting in some asylum requests, which, obviously took quite a lot of work. We were concentrating on that. He was obviously in a very vulnerable position legally wise, and we needed to find somewhere that would accept him and accept his asylum request and help him and keep him safe. He didn't want to be in Russia. That wasn't the plan. We did have onward flights to Cuba. So we were putting in many asylum requests, over 20. That was sort of the main thing we were focusing on. And sadly, especially as a European, much of Europe they either didn't respond or they actually said no. Latin America was positive towards his requests, but we couldn't get there because the US had cancelled his passport. And so in the end, the only option was to apply for asylum in Russia, which is where he obviously remains today.
Sarah Harrison war bei uns. Sprecherin von WikiLeaks, zurzeit in München für eine Konferenz an den Kammerspielen zum Thema Überwachung. Ganz herzlichen Dank fürs Gespräch. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks for having me.